Despite everything the Tennessee Titans have done this offseason, Treylon Burks is still a lock to make the roster. I'll explain why on today's edition of the Locked On Titans podcast.
You are Locked On Titans, your daily Tennessee Titans podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to the Locked On Titans podcast. I am your host, Tyler Rowland. Titans fans, today's edition of the Locked On Titans podcast is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use the code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. We are continuing our positional preview series as we lead up to Tennessee Titans training camp. We're breaking down the wide receiver group. On today's show, I'm going to tell you why Treylon Burks is still a lock to make the roster. Talk about some of the bubble options that are fighting for their roster lives. And we'll talk about some long shots who I quite frankly think have no chance to make the roster. Before we get into it, do want to thank you for making the Locked On Titans podcast your first listen each and every day. Remember, Monday through Friday, Tennessee Titans content all year round, always for free. You're not going to beat that anywhere else. Make sure that you get subscribed, stay subscribed. It's your team every day here on the Locked On Titans podcast. Speaking of every day, shout out to my everydayers out there tuning in Monday through Friday. If you aren't an everydayer, you need to be one because training camp and the season is right around the corner, and you never want to miss an episode of the #1 Tennessee Titans podcast in the world. Today we're doing wide receivers, but tomorrow we're going to do offensive line. We're going to hit into the defense at the end of this week and starting into next week. And again, training camp right around the corner. I'll have my 53-man roster prediction as we head into training camp week. So we'll start with the wide receiver conversation. And I've been doing this as my locks, my bubble guys, and then my long shots. That's how I kind of like to break down these different groups. And when you look at the locks at the wide receiver position, it seems pretty clear to me that the top three, DeAndre Hopkins, Calvin Ridley, Tyler Boyd, are absolute certified locks, okay? Obviously, DeAndre Hopkins, your physical X-receiver, contested catches, jump ball situations. I think Hopkins is going to be a devil in the red zone once again. He fills that role perfectly, and we know that. The chemistry with Will Levis is already there from last year. But then you add in Calvin Ridley, who can now be your speed Z wide receiver off the line of scrimmage, go in motion. He's going to create more of the big plays down the field, create that separation, and I think quick timing routes. If you have a 3rd and 3, all right, and you need to get a ball out of your hands quickly because the defense is bringing a blitz, Calvin Ridley is the guy to go to. Let him do a quick shake at the line of scrimmage, hit on the inside slant route. Calvin Ridley is a guy who should be able to get open quickly with speed, and that should help Will Levis tremendously because that skill set just was not on the roster last year. So I think those two, Hopkins and Ridley, complement each other perfectly, and they fill their roles perfectly. Obviously, Tyler Boyd as the veteran in the slot, short yardage guy, physical slot receiver. He can be a chain mover. Like I just mentioned with Calvin Ridley, now you have another guy in Tyler Boyd who maybe doesn't have the speed of Calvin Ridley, but has the quickness and the awareness and the understanding of how defenses work in the NFL at this point, where he can get open quickly and just help the Titans move the chains. Now, one thing I will say about Tyler Boyd, I think he might end up being more of a role player than people imagine. The Titans have a ton of different people that they could throw into the slot. We talked about Chigakonkwo earlier this week and how I think with him not being a traditional tight end, he could see some slot work. Obviously, you have a draft pick in Jaquan Jackson. What are we going to see from Kyle Phillips? Is he going to make the team? You could put Treylon Burks in the slot. You could put Calvin Ridley in the slot. DeAndre Hopkins has functioned in the slot as well. So I think the Titans will do some rotations. We won't see Hopkins, Ridley, Boyd in the slot all the time. I think we'll see a combination of Treylon Burks out wide with Calvin Ridley in the slot and Hopkins out wide, or Hopkins in the slot with Ridley and Burks out wide. I think the Titans are going to be able to use those matchups based on the team that they're playing. And because everybody kind of has a diverse skill set, I mean, even a guy like NWI can work in the slot and might take some snaps away from Tyler Boyd. So I think that Tyler Boyd is an absolute lock to make this roster, but I think his role within the team may not be as heavy as maybe some people are suggesting. I think we'll see a nice rotation there, but obviously Tyler Boyd fills his role. Really, it's Treylon Burks that I want to make my big point about here, and I led with it, explain. Burks is a lock to make this roster. And I think what happens is, and this happened with Caleb Farley now, Burks has been a much better player than Caleb Farley. We got to give Burks his credit there. But a lot of people last year were like, the Titans need to cut Caleb Farley. They need to release Caleb Farley. And there are some people who are saying that about Treylon Burks now. Just cut him. Just get rid of him. They don't need him. Blah, 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 blah. And I know that's a small minority, but let me just say, if you feel that way, the Titans would actually lose $2.6 million in cap space if they cut Treylon Burks. So it makes zero sense for them to release him. Look, I have been banging the table all offseason long that the Titans should consider a trade for Treylon Burks. But I think at this stage, when rosters are mostly set, it would take an injury or some sort of situation with another team for a team to give the Titans anything of value for Treylon Burks. I think like the Steelers could make some sense. They don't have a wide receiver 2 outside of George Pickens. If they got desperate as they get through training camp and they realize, oh, our wide receiver group is not good enough, then maybe Treylon Burks could be traded. But as things stand right now, Burks is an absolute lock to make this roster. It just would not make sense in any way to cut Treylon Burks. I mean, again, you're going to lose money on the salary cap because his guaranteed money from next year is going to shrink up into this year if you were to release him. And you need depth. We know as Tennessee Titans fans, injuries happen all the time. And I mean, having another guy who, while he's been a disappointment, still is a talented player as your 4th wide receiver, I think that's a good place for the Tennessee Titans to be. Now, getting Treylon Burks out on the field, I think that he's going to be used in much more of a gadget role this year, which if you go back to college, really where Treylon Burks had his best moments is when he was being used as a gadget player on quick screens, getting the ball to him out of the backfield, things like that. That's where where he doesn't have to run routes. He doesn't have to keep his balance downfield. He could just get the ball in his hands and go. I'm not comparing the talent here, but I think the Titans should consider using Treylon Burks like a Deebo Samuel in San Francisco. Line him up in the backfield. Line him up in the slot and bring him in motion. He can be used a little bit on the outside to run streak routes and run down the field. He can be used on screens. Like, I think the Titans have to get incredibly creative with how they use Treylon Burks. And based on what we've heard from Brian Callahan this offseason, I think that they absolutely will do that. So I understand that people are frustrated with Treylon Burks. I am as high on that list as anybody, but releasing him outright makes no sense. If you can get a good trade, then go ahead. But I think as things stand right now, what we're looking at with this roster, Treylon Burks is an absolute lock to make this team. So that's 4 locks at wide receiver with Hopkins, Ridley, Boyd, and Burks. There's 9 more wide receivers to discuss. And we're going to start with the guys who are on the bubble, because how many wide receivers the Titans keep and who fills those spots at the back end, that is going to be one of the most interesting conversations as we head towards the regular season. And we'll dive into that right now. Before we do, though, do want to let you guys know that today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Look, it's summertime, guys, and that means it's time for Major League Baseball games. And I've been to a few Reds games recently. Such an up and down team, my Cincinnati Reds. But there's nothing like a nice summer day with a flat beer and a cold hot dog. You guys know the vibes. Just a great time. And you can get tickets for any Major League Baseball game on Game Time, because Game Time is the authorized ticket marketplace of Major League Baseball. You can get tickets faster and easier, and the prices on Game Time actually go down as you get closer to the first pitch. You also get the Game Time guarantee. You also get flash deals and zone deals for last-minute tickets. You get an actual panoramic view of what you're going to see from your seat. I mean, I don't know what else you could be looking for, but if that wasn't enough, you also get all-in prices. Like, the price you see for your tickets is actually what you're going to pay, which is very uncommon in the ticket buying marketplace. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets for the MLB with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use the code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. Titans fans, let's continue today's breakdown of the wide receiver position as we do our positional preview series leading up to Tennessee Titans training camp. I don't know if you guys can tell, but I am so hyped. I can smell the football. I can feel it right around the corner. We are so close, and I'm so excited to talk about this team with you guys. Again, make sure that you get subscribed, stay subscribed. This is the #1 Tennessee Titans podcast in the world for a reason. Monday through Friday, daily Titans content. I'm going to break down every training camp practice that's open to media. We're going to be going through all the storylines throughout the next few months as we get to the regular season. You are not going to want to miss it. So get subscribed, stay subscribed. It's your team every day here on the Locked On Titans podcast. But we talked about my roster locks. I don't think it's controversial at all to have Hopkins, Ridley, and Boyd there. Maybe slightly controversial to say that Treylon Burks is a lock to make the roster. I don't really think that it should be, though. But after that is where the conversations really start to happen. The guys that are on the bubble, how many wide receivers will the Titans keep? 6 to 7 is the number that I keep thinking about. The Titans, I could see them keeping 6 wide receivers at minimum, and could potentially see them keep 7 wide receivers. We have talked about this throughout the last few days. I did quarterbacks and tight ends day one, and then did running backs yesterday. If you missed either of those, go back and check it out. But the conversation is, do you only keep 2 quarterbacks so you can keep 7 wide receivers? Do you keep only 3 tight ends so that you can keep 4 running backs? You know, like the math that happens with the roster is something that we're going to be talking about a ton, but I do think it would make sense for the Titans to keep 7 wide receivers. Now, the reality here is I've never really seen a team want to keep more than 6. 6 wide receivers is still a lot of wide receivers. You still have a ton, and obviously wide receiver is a plentiful position where you could have guys on the practice squad, and that's what makes it so curious. Because on the bubble, we have Nick Westbrook-Akine, the boy who will not die. We have Titans 6th round draft pick, Jaquan Jackson. And then we have the old toy that everybody dropped in Kyle Phillips. All right. Out of those 3 players, if there are only 2 spots available, who gets them? That's it. Look, NWI is an incredible utility player. He can play inside. He can play outside. In this new Tennessee Titans system that's going to be a ton of 3 wide receivers, having a guy like Jaquan or having a guy like NWI who can be a slot wide receiver but also function as a tight end, as a good physical blocker, that seems like a valuable skill set for this team. The versatility to play inside and outside, knowing every position, and then having that ability to block and be a pseudo tight end as a slot person, I think that is helpful. And then you add in that NWI cut his teeth as an NFL player on special teams, on coverage units, as a gunner getting down the field. And I think in previous years, because the Titans lack talent at wide receiver, because they lack depth at wide receiver, NWI always got pushed into a role that he shouldn't have been in. He was wide receiver 2 the last 2 years. That is not the proper role for NWI if you want to maximize his value. You're hurting yourself there. So if NWI, because of the depth the Titans have here, if NWI can remain as wide receiver 5, wide receiver 6, something like that, then he can properly have that value on special teams and then be the role player on offense that you want him to be. I honestly, if I'm doing my predictions, I think NWI is going to make the team. Now, I'm not crazy enough to say that he's a lock to make the team because who knows? Maybe the Titans will get special teams value from other positions and they'll look for a guy who's a better wide receiver. But I think NWI is going to make this team. I think whether the Titans keep 6, whether they keep 7, NWI is going to be one of those guys. I really do believe that. So his value, I think, is with special teams and the inside-outside versatility and the skill set. I think he's going to make the team. It's all about hoping that he stays in the right role throughout the year. He doesn't need to be second or third on the team in reps at wide receiver. That would be a disaster, quite honestly. But then you look at two guys who I really think are fighting for the last spot. If there's only 6, this is the battle that we need to discuss. And it's Jaquan Jackson and Kyle Phillips. Both of them are going to be slot-only guys. I don't think either of those guys have the ability to play outside. We know that about Kyle Phillips. And while we can have talks about Jaquan Jackson's potential to do, I think the reality here is a 5'10" guy. He is going to be a slot wide receiver. Okay. So if they're both slot-only guys, who are we rocking with? To me, it's Jaquan Jackson. Look, he's a faster player. I don't mean quickness. Quick is short burst agility, okay? And Kyle Phillips does have very good short burst agility. He does. But when it comes to long speed, like this is the difference between fast and quick, okay? The long speed, Jaquan Jackson is fast, all right? Like 4.40 fast. And if the Titans are going to try to do things like slot fades, slot posts, corner routes from the slot, these deeper, longer routes from the slot, if the Titans want to do those things, which based on what we saw from Brian Callahan in years past, he does want to do some of those things, Jaquan Jackson is certainly a better fit. And when you talk about being a gadget player within the offense, reverses, screens, lining up in the backfield, Jaquan Jackson is going to be able to do all those things better than Kyle Phillips can. And then you get to special teams, which if Kyle Phillips does not figure out how to get back to being a solid punt returner, he's cooked. He's dead in the water. There is DOA. There is no way that Kyle Phillips is going to make this team if he does not show that he can punt return in the preseason. Period. Because Jaquan Jackson not only can punt return, but he could kickoff return too. So, again, I know that we had high hopes for Kyle Phillips. I know that a lot of people love Kyle Phillips and have overrated him. But his inability to stay on the field, Jaquan Jackson's speed, gadget player ability on offense, and special teams ability, Jaquan Jackson just has him beat in so many categories. It is going to be tough, in my opinion, for Kyle Phillips to make this team. And, if we said that last year, I don't think it would be outlandish, but some people would be like, why would Kyle Phillips not make the team next year? And I think all of these factors really go together. I think that Kyle Phillips will have a tough time making the team. If the Titans keep 7, then maybe Kyle Phillips as a direct backup to Jaquan Jackson makes sense. But if they don't keep 7 wide receivers, it's going to be tough sledding for Kyle Phillips. Do want to also mention Colton Dow in this segment. I put him in the bubble section, but the reality is Colton Dow had a gruesome knee injury at the end of last year. He is not expected to be involved in training camp, not expected to be ready for the season. He's going to be on PUP, and since he's going to be on the physically unable to perform list, he's not going to count against the roster. So they'll probably just keep him there throughout the season, and they'll never have to make that decision. So that's why he's on the bubble. If he was healthy, I don't think he'd make it, but considering that, he'll probably stay with the team while he's on PUP. But with that being said, we got to talk about the long shots, and I got to be honest, none of these players have a chance to make the team. So I'll get into that now. Titans fans, let's cap off today's edition of the Locked On Titans podcast, breaking down the wide receiver room as we head towards training camp. We talked about Treylon Burks being a roster lock for this team, along with Hopkins, Ridley, and Boyd. We talked about the bubble math problem that the Titans have with NWI, Jaquan Jackson, and Kyle Phillips. Now I'm going to finish up with some of these long shots that I honestly don't think have any chance to make the team. Before I do, though, do want to thank you guys again for making Locked On Titans your first listen each and every day. Also want to remind you that Locked On has launched the first ever 24/7 sports streaming channel on YouTube. It's called Locked On Sports Today. It's also now available on Amazon Fire TV. Look, Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day. You get insight from local experts like me, the Locked On podcast. You get coverage of every league from our national shows, like Locked On NFL, which I'm on Thursdays if you guys want to check that out. But make sure that you check out Locked On Sports Today, now available on the free Fire TV channels app. But the long shots. So I split these into two categories because there's some familiar names who you will recognize, and then there are the two new undrafted free agent rookies, okay? And regardless of our thoughts and feelings on the veterans, the rookies, I don't think any of these guys are making the team, barring massive injuries. You know what I mean? Like, if 3 wide receivers get hurt during training camp, which, knock on wood, that doesn't happen, then obviously these guys will have a chance. But right now, as things stand with a healthy group, there is no way. So first you have the veterans, all right? Now, I call them veterans, but, you know, first, second, third year, still young players. But you have Mason Kinsey, all right, who is a divisive figure in the Titans community. Some people love him. Some people hate him. I like Mason Kinsey. I love him as a practice squad guy, okay? But look, Kinsey is very similar to Kyle Phillips and Jaquan Jackson. Slot guy, punt return option. He's just not the athlete that those guys are, although he's much more reliable as a punt returner than Kyle Phillips ever was. He just doesn't have the burst and the wiggle because he's not as good of an athlete. But I think Mason Kinsey is a great option on the practice squad. I think the reason that Kinsey is held on so long and the reason Kinsey has stands is just because he is reliable. Now, there's not a lot of high upside, you know, but when he gets out there, he doesn't drop punts. He catches them, keeps the ball with the Titans. When you throw him the ball, if he's open, he's going to make that catch. He's probably not going to make much out of it, but he's going to make that catch. He's just a reliable guy without NFL level talent. So I like him on the practice squad. I hope that they're able to keep him around for that reason. And then you can call him up if one of your Jaquan Jacksons or Kyle Phillips doesn't, you know, is hurt, can't play that week, whatever. The other guy is Kearis Jackson. Now, Kearis Jackson has some real fans out there, some people who really like, and look, we saw some okay things, caught that touchdown pass in the preseason, had some good returns as well, got hurt last year and was out for most of the year. I just think that the math is a hard problem for Kearis. He's more of a slot guy. He does have kickoff return potential, but I think he's just a practice squad level player at the end of the day. I don't think he can challenge NWI or Jaquan Jackson or Kyle Phillips. I just don't think he is. Maybe Kyle Phillips. If the Titans keep 7, I could see maybe Jaquan Jackson getting on, but I think he's just a practice squad level player. And Treylon Harrison, I have him ranked even lower than those other guys. He's another guy who's a smaller receiver, probably needs to be in the slot at the NFL level, but he doesn't give you anything on returns. It's not going to be one of the top returners. I just think Treylon Harrison is a guy who ends up getting cut. Not even practice squad. He's just cut after being on the practice squad a lot of the year last year. Maybe the Titans keep 3 wide receivers there, but you do got to think about the undrafted free agent wide receivers, which we have Bryce Oliver out of Youngstown State, 6'1", 214 pounds. And then Sam Schnee, 5'10", 190 pounds, out of Northern Iowa. And let me say this. I think if the Titans keep a practice squad wide receiver, they need to keep Bryce Oliver, because all of these guys we're talking about, Treylon Harrison, Kearis Jackson, Mason Kinsey, Sam Schnee, they're not as big as Bryce Oliver. Oliver is the only one of them that I would say is a bigger wide receiver. 214, 6'1". I mean, he is significantly bigger than a lot of these other guys that we're talking about in this grouping. So for me, it's all about having specific roles. Okay, you can't just keep 3 slot wide receivers on practice squad. who is your big-bodied physical receiver. Remember, practice squad isn't just, hey, if we need you, we'll call you up. That's the scout team. So when you play these bigger physical wide receivers that you play week in and week out, who is going to simulate them on the practice squad? Bryce Oliver can do that. So then you move to Sam Schnee. Is that the new Mason Kinsey? 5'10", 191, slot guy, do some returning. Like, Mason Kinsey is now heading into, I think, his third year, right? Year 3. And at some point, why would you keep around 24, 25-year-old Mason Kinsey when you could go with someone who has a very similar skill set who's just a younger player? You know what I mean? Like, at some point, you just age out. And it's like, if these guys are kind of equal and one guy's 25 and one guy's younger, why don't I just go with the younger guy? You know what I mean? And I think that could be an issue for Mason Kinsey. But at the end of the day, guys, I don't think any of these 5 wide receivers are making the team. I don't think they have a realistic shot. The Titans have too many good wide receivers up at the top. They're not getting rid of Burks. NWI provides more value and more experience. I think the real battle here is Jaquan Jackson versus Kyle Phillips. Everybody else, I think their position is kind of slotted. Their position is in a good place. So let me know who you guys think are going to end up being the wide receivers that make this team. But that's my thoughts on all the wide receivers. Again, tomorrow, we're going to be talking offensive line. So can't wait to dive into that with you guys. But that is going to do it for me today, folks. As always, I am your host, Tyler Rowland. And this was Locked On Titans.